Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, How Jewish Theater Combats Anti-Semitism. Today's program is part of a Moment series on anti-Semitism supported by the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation and is co-sponsored by the Alliance for Jewish Theater, whose mission is to preserve and promote Jewish theater. Following the program, please visit Moment's website where you can subscribe to the magazine and be sure to register for next week's program about Jews and the Lakota people. Now for today's program. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. David Chack is the artistic director of ShPIeL-Performing Identity in Chicago, Louisville, and Los Angeles. Henne is the artistic director of Theater Dybbuk in Los Angeles. Jenny Rachel Weiner is a playwright and screenwriter. And Hayley is the artistic director of Theater J in Washington, D.C., and she will serve as today's moderator. Hayley?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thanks for inviting us for this conversation. I'm really honored to be in conversation with my colleagues here. Hi, Jenny, David, Aaron, lovely to see you. I just want to start by saying that obviously this is a very tender time for many of us, and we're all really thinking about the devastation of loss of lives. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that and obviously the horror that we're witnessing at this time. So as we are artists, we are thinking about this in our work. Certainly it relates to our topic today. And I think one of the wonderful things about theater is that it is a place to share humanity, our sense of empathy, probing questions around who we are and what we do. And also it's a space to be in community. And so I'm really grateful to be with these three theater artists today. I'd love to start the conversation by talking about how you all think Jewish theater relates to combating anti-Semitism. If you would talk about it just as you see in general, how you think the role of theater, but also as it relates to your own work. Aaron, maybe you would like to kick us off?
Sure, it'd be my pleasure. And again, I'm so grateful to Moment for having us and to the Alliance for Jewish Theater. And thank you, Hayley, for hosting this conversation and helping us along. I've been thinking about this topic, obviously, and I think the first thing is that I think about this idea of, and you framed it beautifully, of combating or intersecting with or questioning or looking at. And as a theater artist, there may be an outcome of combating something, but I think my job is often to provoke, to question, to encourage thought, to encourage relationship, to deeply investigate. And then the outcome of all of those things may be combating anti-Semitism. So, and I think a lot of the theater that I see is often doing that. It is presenting human stories for people to see their own humanity in, or to help understand the world. And in doing so, it then helps to overcome anti-Semitism. I will say in our own work, Theater Dybbuk's work, our current show, I think, has a very direct relationship. It's called The Merchant of Venice Annotated, or In Sooth I Know Not Why I Am So Sad, which is actually the first line of The Merchant of Venice. And it combines The Merchant of Venice with Elizabethan history and news from the last 3 years as a way of looking at how during times of great uncertainty and upheaval, how we may displace our anxieties on the other. And of course, there are many others in that play, but the one we are most familiar with is Shylock as a vehicle to, therefore then we look at anti-Semitism, and we also look at how anti-Semitism becomes a vehicle for other kinds of prejudice as well. We begin to think about Great Replacement theory comes up in the play, and other matters like that then opens the dialogue to include a diversity of perspectives, voices, and experiences. So it's both specific to anti-Semitism and is kind of opening up a pathway to other conversations that are interrelated. So I'll pause there because I want to hear from my colleagues, but that's maybe a good place to start for the work I do and sort of what I think theater can accomplish.
Thank you, Aaron. Jenny, do you want to take it next?
Sure. I would say that my work sort of goes hand in hand with this, in that most of my plays are centering Jewish stories or Jewish families. But more than anything, I think combating anti-Semitism or combating any prejudice or bigotry really for me comes from seeing each other's humanity, witnessing our own selves in someone who is different than us, being able to recognize ourselves in the other. And I think that it just comes down to empathy, being able to feel like we can sit in a space, in a theater with each other and witness a story of real people that we can either learn something new about or feel our own connection to. And I think in this time that is just so divisive, we are so attached, I think, to our own stories. We're in a vortex that it's actually quite hard to separate ourselves from our own bias and opinion and actually open-heartedly listen to someone who feels differently than us. And I think theater is such a beautiful way to be able to do that, because it's human to human. It's not, I mean, in the work I make, it's not necessarily big ideas. There might be big ideas there, but when it comes down to it, it's about people on stage who are feeling deeply. And I use humor in my work. That's my way in. And so in a space where we're able to laugh and cry and feel and be together. And I think something else I'm sure we all feel is that there's no other space that we can be really live with other people experiencing something together in that same way, where it's different every night and we are in conversation. And I think that also brings us back to the idea of being in our own humanity, that we can't hide behind a screen. We can't pause and go do something else. We have to be fully present. And when we're fully present, I think we're able to receive in a deeper way. And I think my work is heart-centered. I think I go character in to out instead of outside in, instead of big ideas in. I'm really working with like what people are feeling and experiencing, and then sort of intuitively understanding kind of what my questions are about those things. And so I think the way to combat anti-Semitism with theater is to show our humanity and to experience together what it's like to be a Jewish person in the world. And hopefully that resonates with Jews and non-Jews alike who are sitting in the audience.
Thank you for that. David, what about for you?
Yeah, well, I'm not a playwright or developer of theater the way Aaron is. I produce and direct, but I do work with playwrights and help them to locate the thing that's within them as well as within the play and connecting those things together. And it's so interesting and I do mostly Jewish theater, but not only. Identity theater can expand into LGBTQ plus theater, queer theater, to Latino theater, to Black African American theater. I've done quite a bit of that, as well as the intersection of Jewish theater. And I found that over time now, we are seeing that intersectionality expand even more, and yet that still connects with the combating of anti-Semitism. And I say this in the senses, and we had a little conversation earlier about the word combating, and that's a little bit fraught in a sense, but that it's challenging anti-Semitism. I think for me, that's a better word. And I found that one of the first plays I did when I started ShPIEL here in Chicago was a play called The Invasion of Skokie, which is a play about neo-Nazis who marched here in Skokie, great place to do it. And in fact, it directly connected with anti-Semitism. But now, the most recent play I produced, I did not write, Michelle Brooks wrote it, an incredible play called Hitler's Tasters. This is a play about women, girls, who tasted Hitler's food in order for him not to be poisoned. But it's done in such a kind of avant-garde, surreal way. It really takes out the empathy all around. I'm now going into a different direction than empathy here, and gets us to really see and think about what we're hearing and the absurdity and surrealness of hatred, of being implicit in fascism, and also the ways that the state is oppressing women's bodies and creating situations of racism, anti-Semitism, etc. It's a really powerful play, and I just thought it was incredible. And everybody that saw it, that obviously we all think our audiences really take something away from it, but I'm still hearing accolades about it. And now my most recent play that I'll be producing is ShPIeL in School. And I think that once again helps to combat or challenge anti-Semitism in the sense that we're going to see this moment of Marc Chagall with his wife, Bella, and how the two of them created this school in Russia, in Belarus at the time, in Vitebsk, where he came from, and the incredible Jewish art that they were creating. And then a year later, Stalin came in, clamped down, synagogues were ravaged, pogroms were happening, and thankfully Chagall had already gotten out and made his way to Paris, which then, faced with the Holocaust, he had to make his way to the United States. So I think the challenge that we're seeing in plays of anti-Semitism is getting even stronger in the works that we're doing now, which is something that I think has happened over the time that I've been doing ShPIeL.
That's interesting that you think that there's been a change in a more direction towards that focus. It was interesting to hear about your project and to hear a little bit from you, Erin, about your project as well. And what I love is that everyone's got a very unique aesthetic and point of view. And Jenny, I would love to if you would share a little bit more about your project, since you didn't quite get into that. And I just say very happy that Theater J is producing Jenny's play, The Chameleon, which is starting previews tomorrow. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you came to write that play.
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, my work usually is like there's questions that I'm sort of bubbling up in me, and I'm trying to understand like why something's sort of scratching at my door. And I started writing this play in 2019, and it was really around conversations about representation in media and about who gets to tell whose stories. And I felt there was just such a strong and exciting moment of people really owning their identity and saying, this is who I am, and I feel empowered to be able to tell my own story. And I felt that I was noticing that movement was happening for most everybody except for Jewish people. And I was watching a lot of art being made around me, TV shows, movies, where there were deeply Jewish stories that were being produced, and many of the people portraying Jews or the makers of the work were not Jewish. And there was just this sort of double standard I was curious about. I was like, what is it? Like, what is it here that we're missing? And so I just started to like delve deeper into these questions that I had and why it was sort of like scratching at my door. And, I have my feelings about this have evolved over the past 5 years. The play has evolved over the past 5 years. But what the play is ultimately about is a woman who gets cast as the lead of the newest superhero franchise called The Chameleon. And the Chameleon superpower is to know when to stand up and stand out in order to save the world, or when to hide for survival. And it is a direct parable for Jewish assimilation and the ways in which Jews came to this country and had to assimilate to survive. But what is that double-sided coin of when we lose part of our identity? What does that mean for us? And what happens to our cultures and customs and voice? And so it is a big, raucous, intergenerational comedy that is exploring anti-Semitism and representation and social media and the ways in which we get so trapped in story, and we can get we can sort of get taken for a loop by viral memes and videos and how like what is true and what is not, and this idea of like trying to save the narrative. And ultimately, this woman has to decide whether she's going to continue to blend in to get farther ahead in her career for personal gain, or if she's going to decide to step out and own her Jewish identity and continue on her family's legacy and her ancestors' experience. And so, yeah, it's a very exciting, bold play. I'm so grateful that Hayley and Theater J are doing this play. I'm just so moved, and for it to be happening right now in this moment feels very intense and important. It is a play about Jewish joy, and it's a play about a Jewish family, and it's also a play about what it means to be Jewish, and the different ways in which we either carry on our Jewish legacy or ways in which we filter it through our modern lens. But I'm really, really excited to be making it right now. So that's the play.
Thank you, Jenny. As of course, the next step is the audience. So I'm kind of curious to hear, well, I'm excited for the audience to come see this play, but I also would love people to maybe talk a little bit about the audience. I know, Erin, in your work, you really are reaching a very broad audience. And I'm wondering if you could talk about if that's intentional for you, how, and a bit about who you're making the work with and who's receiving the work.
Sure, thanks. So Theater Dybbuk creates all of its work over 1 to 3 years per project with an ensemble. So I want to start there. And the ensemble is made up of people who are Jewish, not Jewish, from a variety of walks of life. And so part of the experience is that dialogue that happens as we're developing the work, and the learning that happens kind of from all sides. I've even had artists who are engaged on that level discover their own covert anti-Semitism and sort of express, I didn't realize I believed this, and now I understand, and that's very moving to find that. And of course, I have to face my own prejudices about their backgrounds and it comes up. It is truly an exchange. And I think that's part of the power, is that it is not exclusive. It is not an inward looking conversation. It's an outward looking conversation in a variety of ways. And I think that is also true of the audience. In an ideal world, our audience is made up of, if I were to put it in percentages, 50% people who aren't Jewish, maybe 50% who are, maybe as a way to encourage conversation, dialogue, and also the experience of sitting side by side with somebody who you are sharing this moment, even if what's going on internally may be very different. And we find we are laughing at different moments, we are gasping at different moments, and we are learning from each other in that exchange, right? We often talk about theatrical conversation, and theatrical conversation is not just actually what's being said to one another. It's the conversation that is happening in the exchange of energies and the exchange of awarenesses in a room. So briefly, I'll just say, for example, this current Merchant of Venice work is touring throughout the country. We're going to 6-7 cities with it. And it's so fascinating because, it's theatrically fairly adventurous in certain ways. And we are putting people in spots of productive discomfort, where we are showing the ways in which history repeats itself. It's deeply scholarly. And we're also kind of reminding people of the things they're encountering every day, that they may not always realize what's going on. So there are moments in the piece, for example, where we hear what I call the dog whistle speeches, where we actually hear modern day speeches and the entire cast blows into dog whistles. So the first one, for example, is Viktor Orban speaking at CPAC and talking about George Soros, and the entire cast blows into dog whistles while he's speaking and dumps $100 bills on the stage. There's some obvious metaphors going on. And it's interesting, though, to process people understanding that they've been taking in information that they may not even realize. The Orban one is fairly obvious, but others, they may not always realize what it's playing on and what prejudices and beliefs it is pulling upon. And so that's been interesting to see. And ideally, I want people to have those realizations. And I always say I'm in the long game. A seed is planted that may not bear fruit for a long time. But the hope is that we're helping to move humanity along a centimeter or an inch towards greater awareness and understanding. And that may be one of the ways, as David said, we challenge anti-Semitism. That seed is planted. So next time they hear about George Soros, or they hear something, they go, oh, is that what's going on? It puts a question in the mind that may not have an answer, but at least allows the question to live. So that's a little of that experience. And I think the power of diversity in the room.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Be curious to hear from others. I know at Theater J about 60% of our audience is Jewish and 40% is not Jewish, roughly. So we're definitely thinking about that exchange of ideas with Jewish and non-Jewish audience members. And also we do a lot of work going into schools as well, bringing in our public schools. A lot of people are not Jewish, part of the public schools, and going into those schools as well. So I think I'm just curious, maybe David or Jenny, if you want to speak to the fact of, like, as you're making work, what do you think about that in terms of the collaborators you're working with in the room? Because it sounds like, at least in Aaron and your process, there's an exchange of ideas even in the room that's potentially combating or challenging anti-Semitism or even other biases that exist, plus then the external, like bringing in audiences. Yeah, David.
Yeah, quick. I really like how the conversation now has turned to diversity. And that not only is something that I see in my audiences, but as Aaron says, also in the actors and people involved in the production. So when we have stories that are Jewish stories, that are stories about racism, that are stories that are African-American stories, like I did a production of a relatively new play called The Green Book. And it's about the Green Book that Black people used in order to know where they could stay and during the Jim Crow South, but not only, all the way up until recent times. That book was used in order for Black people to feel comfortable where they were, to know what gas stations they could go to, what restaurants, what nightclubs. And then within the journey of the play, a Holocaust survivor shows up at someone's house. And they say, "What are you doing here?" He says, "I'm not going to stay in any place that's racist. And because of what happened to me in the Holocaust, I need to be with you." And that just shifted the whole discussion, both in the play. This was written by a Black man. He came to me. He wanted to work on that and work on that part of the play with me. And I not only was glad to do that, but then also to see how the actors, the people involved with the production, were learning about Black people don't know about the Green Book, many of them, and they don't know that existed. Victor Hugo Green and his book for Negro motorists, and that book was influenced by Jewish books that were similar for people to know where to go for Jewish entertainment, or to hotels in the Catskills where they could go. And Victor Hugo Green went to a Jewish book publisher, but he didn't know that the book publisher was Jewish. And he just said, "Would you do this?" And the Italian, nothing against Italians, but in this case, it was someone who was working with him, said, "I'm not going to publish this book by the, and then he used the N-word. And the Jewish publisher said, "If you don't publish this book, you will never get a job here in New York again." And Calvin Ramsey said, "This is a story that has to be told. We have to bring these two people together." And this, not only intersectionality, but the diversity of the actors, all this is a way to challenge anti-Semitism, because we're bringing together people from so many different backgrounds. It's so important.
Yes, definitely agree. It's important to bring in people from different backgrounds, and also to acknowledge that, as Jews, there's many different types of Jews that exist. Certainly many Jews of color. One of the things that we're doing at Theater J is commissioning 7 writers through our Expanding the Canon program to bring those voices to light, because I think that there's some things to learn too around intersectional identity that maybe us in the room don't have access to. So I think those voices are really important to highlight and uplift it as we continue in our work. I'm curious to hear a bit more from the group on has the fact that there's been an increase in anti-Semitism in this country, unfortunately, something that is true, has that influenced you at all? It doesn't have to be about your work necessarily or directly, but just you as a theater maker. Anyone want to take that question?
I can
Yes,
jump
Jenny.
in. Yes, very much so. I think that I mean, I can really just speak to this play right now because it's so present in my life, but it feels very brave and scary to be making a very Jewish play at a Jewish center in this moment where, you know, there's police presence and security around, and I'm scared to drop my son off at preschool. And like, there is real fear. And I think that real fear is an opportunity to, in the similar themes of the play, decide, am I going to back away or am I going to step out even further? And this, you know, just as a bit of an anecdote, not that I necessarily think like social media and Instagram is a way to have activism in a real way, but like in my small moments, I feel, you know, the last couple of days, I've been like really sort of in that doom scroll world. And I did have a moment the other day where I was like, you know what? I think I'm just going to sit it out on Saturday. I was like, I'm tired. I'm going to sit it out. And then another part of me like slapped my face and was like, what do you mean you're going to sit it out? This is the moment. This is the moment to be brave and to speak out. This is the moment to say how you feel. And it's okay if there are consequences. It's okay if you mess up. It's okay if you don't have all of the facts in this moment, because you can always come back and admit, you know, vulnerability or admit some fumbling. And it has made me feel so much more brave, actually, and so much more in myself, because I feel like I have a voice and my voice matters, and other people feel, I think, you know, when you see other people speaking out, I think you can feel then inspired to do it yourself as well. And so I do think it's this threshold of like, you know, do I just step out and be present in this moment, or do I choose to kind of blend into the background? And it feels very present the last few days.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. I will offer that I think the last few years I have found myself called on to be both more direct and more precise. And what I mean by that is theater dybbuk's work is about provocation, and I think I mentioned earlier productive discomfort. It often asks audience to wrestle in a way that can leave them feeling a little upended, uncertain, all of those things. And that's the call, what I'm called to do as an artist. Other artists are called to do other things. And a few years ago, and actually it started getting developed pre-pandemic, the show never had a full life because, you know, something happened in 2020. We were developing a work called Breaking Protocols that was an exploration of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And when I was working on that, I suddenly became aware that some of my usual tools of sort of certain kinds of provocation, I started to question, because I started to say, am I provoking in a way that's actually not clear enough that the play is actually saying this is false, this is untrue and comes from a place of X, Y, and Z. And so I was called on as an artist to not confuse productive discomfort and provocation with confusion or uncertainty or needless mystery. And I think sometimes, you know, ambiguity can be positive, but can also be a kind of shield for a lack of clarity. And I think this moment in this time called on me to be more clear as an artist, right? And to make sure that the metaphors are doing what they are supposed to do, not because sometimes when working in metaphor, it's easy to say, well, it's metaphor, people will interpret it how they will, but I at least have to be clear on what they are, right? And so and so, for example, the merchant piece, which I've mentioned, I mean, it's very direct. It's it's an annotated work. It is saying, here is the history. Here's what was going on in time. Here is where this comes from. People can interpret it through their own lens, but the piece itself knows what it's doing. So I think this moment has asked for that. And it's actually probably made me a better artist because I can't be flippant. I can't be easy about it. I have to be hard on the work so that it is precise and respectful of the gravity of the situation.
I think that's so interesting to hear you articulate in that way, Aaron, that around the directness and how that maybe even shifted a bit of your own aesthetic and your own approach, that the intention had to be so clear, that I'm sure that influenced, what was seen on stage. So that's great to hear. What about for you, David?
Yeah, well, just playing off of that too, I think the directness rather than the kind of symbols can bring us allyship with others, because what often happens when you have metaphors and symbols is that becomes a kind of INSI language. That becomes something that people who share that thinking can be part of, but others that don't know what that language is feel outside of it. If we can be open and embracing to others that are not just, being or are connected to a Jewish identity or to what Jews have gone through, and also show that this is a connection to who they are. For instance, when we did Hitler's Tasters, we had incredible discussions afterwards, and the audience members really wanted to stay. And when they stayed, they not only talked about the show and what they saw and about themselves, but also how they wanted to do something about it, how they wanted to be involved because they saw, what was being depicted in Hitler's Tasters was a metaphor for the time that we're in as well. But that was a metaphor we all shared. It was not something that was, something about Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments, or, the Aseret Dibrot, something that nobody would understand who's not well-versed in those things. And the allyship that's necessary in order to challenge anti-Semitism is so necessary. And I think it's important for us to think in those terms. I mean, me as a producer and less as a playwright has to write what a playwright has to write. That I strongly believe. But, we can think about that. How can the ways that our works reach out create allyship?
I just want to jump in quickly and say, I think that this time is asking us to be more direct in the ways in which we're listening to each other's experience, the ways in which we're filtering it through our own lens and having to own up to our own bias and say, there is a lot that I don't know, and I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to study and start to investigate my own internal systems of bias, my own internal prejudice. I think really in the last few years, we are being called to be more direct. And I think that is definitely influencing the way that I'm making theater. And I think the theater that I'm seeing. And I also think an audience feels actually, and it's funny, Aaron, when you talk about the discomfort, and I'm really interested in that. It's not the way that I think about things. And so it's so cool to sort of be in dialogue about this. I'm actually really interested in making an audience feel very comfortable so that they're gushy and open. And then I'm here's the stuff. And then they get to absorb it, and then it's inside. Right. And so I think a container, a really clear container, lets an audience feel safe and comfortable to experience whatever is being thrown at them. And actually, what you're talking about the discomfort, that's also a container for an audience. It's different than mine, but it is a container. And so the directness of that, I think, is just really useful and productive in this moment.
Yeah, I love that, distinguishing between that sort of heart-centered, are we going to go there emotionally and get people comfortable and then talk about these maybe challenging questions, or are we going to start from as David, you had said before, but like a kind of a brain space, of a more like cerebral space, and then, putting empathy a little bit to the side of the conversation. So I just love that everyone is approaching their work with almost a similar intention, but a very different approach. It's just exciting to hear about that. Yes, David.
Yeah, my play that I'm about to produce in Louisville, which is an incredible play about the great artist Marc Chagall, is kind of the way Jenny describes her work. A wonderful playwright, Jim Sherman, good friend of mine, did it here in Chicago. It's this just gorgeous play about beauty, about love, about the need for art in our lives and how that helps us to not only live our lives, but enhance our lives even more. This is a kind of play that I don't usually direct. So I'm going to have to get some lessons from you, Jenny. And and yet, when you look at Marc Chagall's life and what he went through, and what he went through in Belarus when he started this school, as I was describing before, in Vitebsk, that the Russian government, after the revolution, allowed him to start. And there were mostly Jewish artists there because they couldn't go to other conservatories. And that was anti-Semitic, yet they created this, really vibrant, artistic world. And then a year later, shut down. Stalin came in. Synagogues were pillaged, Torah scrolls were destroyed. Chagall had escaped, thankfully, first to Moscow, then to Paris. But then he saw and continued to see Vitebsk in his imagination as the place that he would always go through. In almost every single painting he did, he either was painting goats or Vitebsk or his wife Bella. She was his muse. And that was in almost every single thing. But still, it didn't stop him from recognizing what was going on in the world at the time. So the kind of, they say behind every cloud is a silver lining. Well, in Chagall's case, behind every silver lining, there's actually a cloud. And the cloud is there. And we can't forget the cloud. And later on in his life, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about art that continues to inspire us. Chagall did this incredible work that was one of the greatest works of the 20th century, The White Crucifixion. And it shows Jesus as a Jew. It's here at the Art Institute in Chicago. He's wearing a tallis. Actually, the tallis is over his genital area. It's just he's on the cross and says in Hebrew, Father, why did you forsake me? And the Hebrew is right there. Jesus is a Jew. The pogroms that took place in Russia, the Holocaust that's about to happen, all that is there. And Chagall never forgot Vitebsk and never forgot how that's also part of who he is as a Jew.
It's interesting that you mentioned that idea of the clouds always there, right? The clouds always there, which maybe we might, for this conversation, interpret as anti-Semitism, is maybe always there as a force. And yet, I also heard, Jenny, you mention Jewish joy and other things like that. And I'm curious, as you were approaching your work, how do you balance that, right? How do you balance the cloud is always there with a sense of the Jewish joy, Jewish culture, other things that we want to be part of the Jewish theater experience? How does that balance factor for you?
I mean, I think that the cloud is always there is like one of the most Jewish things you could say. It's like even amidst the joy and the food and the family and the shtick, it's like, but the cloud is always there. And like that's Jewish. Like the suffering, it's like that's always there. And I think that's sort of very specific to Judaism. I'm sure other cultures have something similar. I can only speak to my own, that I just find it to be go hand in hand. And so, I don't only write Jewish plays. I have a few plays that feel very Jewish. I have many plays that don't. But no matter what, the viewpoint is always through that lens of humor. And when I say gushy, just to clarify, I don't mean like ethereal. I mean like, ooh, let me get cozy in my seat and like laugh. And then I'm laughing and then suddenly I'm crying because I was open enough to feel the thing. But I think, like, for me, the Jewish joy and the Jewish suffering are intertwined. And I think letting the duality of that exist feels important. And I think that there is a tendency when you're talking about, Jewish stories to like really focus on, we were talking about this earlier, the Holocaust or pogrom, really the dark. But something that Chagall did so beautifully is paint beautiful art that you look and you go, oh, it's so beautiful. And then you stop and you look a little deeper and there are all the clouds. And so I think there's also, as we talked about, containers, like that is a container so that an audience, a viewer of this art is able to step in and feel allowed to be a part of it instead of feeling like a spectator and it's not accessible. And so I think there's something accessible when you have both together.
So interesting hearing this again, Jenny. I think sort of coming at it from very different experiences, which is wonderful. I think for the work we do, the way I would approach it is to say, questions of joy are not on the table. And I don't mean that in a dark way. What I mean is like we have a board member who used to joke that our slogan should be theater dybbuk, eat your vegetables. I know it's not a great promo for coming to work, but that there is what I would say is what our work is up to is about deep listening. And so in deep listening, you experience the whole range of emotions and have new understanding. And joy may come up in that, and darkness may come up in that, and the clouds and the rain and the sunshine and all of that may be present because we're asking you to listen so deeply and to pay such close attention that you are noticing things inside yourself and noticing things about the history around it. So that's where that comes, is that it's actually not about this is dark or bad or this is a cloud. It's actually, here's the information, here's the human experience, and you're going to process it. I think about, as a companion to the Merchant piece, we are touring a piece called The Villainy You Teach, which is a performance artwork that's a kind of an installation piece, where while the whole cast is reading The Merchant of Venice, the original text, one actor is doing the famous Shylock speech, hath not a Jew eyes, if you prick us do we not bleed, again and again for 2 hours. And audience can come in and out. We've done it now 3 places, we're about to do it a 4th. Some people stay for 2.5 hours because they want to see what that actor's experience is going to have been. Some come for 20 minutes and treat it like a museum experience where they see the exhibit and then leave. But I think in that fraught speech, which has been used in a variety of ways and taken on so many meanings, if somebody sits there for 2 hours and watches an actor go through whatever they go through in 2 hours, they are going to have that whole range and go, this contains multitudes, and I contain multitudes, and our history that this has existed within for the last 500 years contains multitudes. So it's about opening a space for people to experience it all, but sort of not being prescriptive about it. So it's just such a different approach, which is lovely to hear.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real fast because that reminds me, Aaron, of that. Did you go to the Jewish Museum in Berlin? I don't know if they still have that, but they're at the end of their regular exhibit, they had as one exhibit, Ask a Jew a Question. And they had a Jewish person on a podium sitting there, and you could ask a Jew, and so many people came and just really embraced doing that. And so many people had never met a Jew before. And to just encounter and engage with both the idea of a Jew, speaking directly to a Jew, watching when you talked about the Shylock speech, I thought about, which is, we often think of Merchant of Venice as this Jewish play. It's not a Jewish play, at least that I don't see it that way at all. And I also see it as one of the most anti-Semitic plays ever written, which continues to be done over and over and over again. And that's something that, if we're talking about challenging anti-Semitism, and here you are, Aaron, really doing that, I applaud you for that, because you're challenging the way that play not only is often done within the Shakespeare canon, but how it's seen as this noble play, almost like the noble savage of Othello. It's really, in some ways, very anti-Semitic how it continues to be used that way. So I really commend you on that.
Well, it's interesting to think about taking that play, as you articulated, to be as an anti-Semitic play, and yet using that text itself to turn in on itself, right? Which is interesting because you're taking this old text that was anti-Semitic, turning in on itself. Jenny's creating a new text, from a contemporary perspective to see that. So it's really lovely to get, again, not just different perspectives, but different modes of operating, within the theatrical canon, creating new work, returning to old work, etc. I know that we wanted to save some time for questions. And so I don't know, Suzanne, is this a good moment to open it up to our audience?
Sure. Thank you all for that fantastic conversation. We really appreciate it. Let's start with this one. There's been more consideration of intergenerational trauma in recent years. How do you see differences in experiencing and understanding anti-Semitism across current generations and their responses to that issue in the theater?
I'll take a stab at it. Yeah. The one play that comes to mind for me in terms of this kind of trauma that's passed down from generation to generation is what is going to go to Broadway, the musical version of Transparent. And within Transparent, which was a TV show by Faith Soloway, that TV show references epigenetics and the continual transmission of either cultural trauma or perhaps genetic trauma. I'm not a scientist, so I don't pretend to know, but evidently they're finding more and more out about this. So, this cloud that's behind every silver lining might actually be in our genes. And the ways that is being depicted in performance is actually interesting, and also brings to mind for me how Tom Stoppard did not realize his Jewishness and now has kind of accepted it and does it through Leopoldstadt. It's interesting the speech that he gave at the Tony Awards and how he really didn't mention about being a Jew at all in that speech, and did this whole speech about AI and playwrights. And I found it to be, once again, a kind of retreat from what he does in Leopoldstadt, which is similar. I think it sounds a little bit like what you're doing, Jenny, as well, which is this story of the pressure to fit in, to assimilate. And that's what Leopoldstadt is about.
Yeah, I'd say.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm going to lead you in, and then you can go. I was going to say that I've been, one of the things that I do is I read a lot of plays, and I've been reading more and more plays that are dealing with intergenerational stories, particularly around like third generation Holocaust survivor stories. So it seems to be in the zeitgeist, I would say. And of course, Jenny's play sits in that category. So I'm going to pass it over to Jenny to talk about why an intergenerational story.
Yeah, I actually have another play called Damsels that I wrote in 2016 about epigenetics. And I think, I did a lot of research for that play, but I'm also not a scientist, so it's funneled through the lens of how I see that as theatrical, and like cross casting in different time periods, the granddaughter playing the grandmother. Anyway, but I think that what what I'm actually most interested in the conversation of inherited trauma and inherited trauma genetically, is that the way to stop the genes from continuing to be passed on in the ways in which, because the genes get turned on and off based on the trauma, and that's the science behind it. That then you are born with those genes either on or off. Essentially, this is the layman version of it. But the way to stop that trauma is to acknowledge it and to approach it head on, and to not bury it, and to not put it under the rug, because when you put it under the rug, it continues to pass down. And so what I have been seeing, I think, in the zeitgeist, and also working on myself, is how do we not continue to pass down the trauma, and how do we approach it head on, and acknowledge and honor our ancestors' stories without needing to further the trauma to the next generation.
Thank you. Let's see if we can get to a few more here. Are you surprised that shows like Leopoldstadt and Parade have been so successful when it's not just a Jewish audience? And as a result of that, do you think there will be more plays with Jewish themes in it that will continue forward?
I will say certainly at Theater J, there will be many plays with Jewish themes continuing forward. So I can offer that. And as others are continuing to think about this, I mean, I think that, I'd be curious to get other people's thoughts, but, Parade obviously was a revival. So it was a play that existed before, whereas Leopoldstadt is a new play written by a very prominent writer, Tom Stoppard. I'm very interested in what are the new stories by maybe some of the people that we haven't heard from yet, and what are those stories that are going to be bubbling up. And I'm curious to see, will those also receive that sort of attention and momentum?
Great.
I mean, just
go ahead.
Oh, please, Suzanne, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the hopeful part of me says, yes, it's it is evidence of a sort of growth edge, and although one could say, when have these plays shown up before, what cultural specificity has been successful, and so forth. But I agree, there's sort of we'll have to see. These are both prominent works by prominent artists, and there's always questions of, I would say, a more general question of how we invite audience into new work by authors they may not be familiar with, and styles that may be adjusting and evolving from that which they are accustomed to. So I think there are questions going on that aren't just about cultural specificity, they're actually about familiarity and comfort.
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead, David.
Well, just quickly also about the commercialism aspect of it. When you have a play that's by Tom Stoppard, I mean, who's going to miss a Tom Stoppard play? It doesn't matter what level it's at. And some people were really disappointed with it, by the way. They went to it and they thought, oh, this isn't a Tom Stoppard play. There are no laughs here. There's no, maybe a couple little chuckles, but it wasn't the same as what he normally writes. It's not travesties. And then Parade, people need to realize, when Parade first came out, it was not well accepted. It was not people flocking to it, and it did all right, but needed changes. And then it got some more changes at the warehouse, at Dunbar Warehouse in London. So things need work. They need time to incubate as well. And Broadway doesn't allow for that. You've got to nail it. You got to have the money, or that's it. I mean, that's why we need Theater J. That's why we need Theater Dybbuk, because the work that you guys are doing is allowing, and I'm also trying to do that, allowing new voices to come forward. And okay, are they going to go to Broadway? Probably not, but are they going to be seen by community and have impact and make a real sense of connection in our lives? I really hope so.
Thank you. I'm going to put two questions together here. We live in a time with a lot of censorship. So have you ever felt that you needed to be censored, or you've been pressured to be censored with your productions? And then also, have you ever experienced or dealt with anti-Semitism within the theater community itself? Someone like to jump in?
Definitely. I think I would say that this is a whole other panel about internalized anti-Semitism and the ways in which that affects the American theater, but that is a completely different panel, and would take a lot longer to talk about. But I do think that there is, I think there is inherent bias often with the kinds of actors people want in plays, and the way people look and what their last names are. And this is a different conversation, but yes, I think I've experienced just some sort of latent bubbling under the surface. I wouldn't necessarily call it anti-Semitism, but I think it's some internalized stuff coming through.
Anybody want to answer about censorship?
Well, I did Indecent in Louisville, Paula Vogel's incredible play, Indecent, that is about queerness, it's about Jewishness, it's about klezmer, and bringing all those things together. And it was so interesting to me how quite often people left out the Jewish part of it. They said, oh, this is a play about queerness. This is a play about the queer community. And it is, absolutely. But it's also about Jewish culture. And it's about the power of klezmer. And that play was censored in Jacksonville, Florida. A school for the performing arts wanted to do it. And then not only did they stop them, the school board stopped them from doing it, but then they had to deal with anti-Semitic incidents where rocks were putting in their driveway. The Goyish Defense League was taking credit for all of this. I mean, this was a really strong anti-Semitic incident. Now, that didn't happen to me personally, but I wrote about it for the foreword, and Paula and I were in contact about it, and it was just despicable. And unfortunately, these incidents are going to happen even more. I know of something that just happened today. I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's happening as we see the situation happening in Gaza and Israel as well, unfortunately.
And kind of as we wrap up, you have all beautifully stated how important Jewish theater is, not just in general, but also to challenging anti-Semitism and other areas of hate. And so, but we all know theater costs money, both for you as the ones who make it, but also for those who go and see it. And so what are ways that we can find to provide more access to people so that they can experience the theater and be exposed to some of these ideas and hopefully find ways to learn more?
Well,
Yeah, I would say just one thing in terms of Theater J. One of our efforts is, as I mentioned, bringing in school groups, and those are free performances that we're doing for school groups that we're bringing in as a way to really get people to connected with Jewish stories and Jewish culture that may not have access to that otherwise, and to theater in general. And also we have a passport program, which offers free tickets. We do a lot of discounted tickets. So we really try to make it accessible for anybody who wants to come. We have pay what you can previews. So if you're in the area, come on by tomorrow for pay what you can. So that's something that we're really mindful of, because we do want anyone who wants to come to be able to come.
Yeah. Thanks, Hayley. I would say in dialogue with that, our work is sort of, we produce in kind of a non-traditional format. We do limited runs in Los Angeles, and then we partner with different organizations for runs in other places. And because of that, we actually rely primarily on earned revenue from other streams, which is having to do with some of our educational work, and also from grant support. And so almost all of our tickets are low or no cost to the public, and to almost every show. And what that means is that though it requires real back-end support and work in order to make that possible. So in answer to your question, I mean, I think a lot of people think of supporting the arts by going to it and paying for a ticket, which I will not deter you from. But I would say is that that ticket, depending on the organization, is covering anywhere from 10 to 60 or 70% of the cost. And there's a lot more to cover that has to do with both overhead, paying of artists, the actual doing. And, this work requires support that isn't the direct one-for-one reciprocal relationship. It's a much longer reciprocal relationship of I'm investing in this. And this is work that helps to move our world along to something greater. So I think keeping that in mind when you are making your philanthropic choices, I think is important.
Great. And we have time for maybe one more. If everybody has a final thought that they'd like to share with everybody, whether it's about what you're working on or the theme of today's conversation. Anybody? Well,
I
then
just
I
want
would
to
just
say
like
thank
to
you
say-
just thank you for including me on the panel. I'm very honored to be here and among such amazing artists and with two incredible organizations.
Great. Well, and on that note, I really want to thank Hayley and Aaron and Jenny and David for joining us today. And thank you to our audience. I especially want to thank Willow Jade Norton, who is the executive director of the Alliance for Jewish Theater, for helping to organize today's program. Please know that I will send out an email in a few days that will include links. I had already put links to everyone's theaters in the chat, but I will resend that along with a link to this program, which you can please share with others, along with a few articles from Moment. I do want to mention David spoke a lot about Hitler's Tasters, and we did a program with Michelle Brooks, the writer of that play, and we had a whole conversation with the cast. And so I will share a link to that program as well. Please go to momentmag.com where you can register for next week's program about Jews and the Lakota people. We thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.